John le Carre, we might have read some of his books in the library and so on. He actually used to work for British intelligence, but then he became a novelist. And so what you read are novels, right? What is true, a semblance of truth, you'll never know. Because that's the way the intelligence world works. But he's a novelist. I'm engaging with you as a history teacher, and so you can believe everything I say. I'm not a novelist. Okay? First of all. Secondly, if you look in this timeline period, that era of modernity goes all the way out for 500 years. It's a period of European colonization, empire building around the world. Wherever the colonies were established, the colonial powers had to put their military in terms of conquest and conquering. And this is where espionage and intelligence starts coming into the equation. You'll see that here we are talking about the build-up to World War I, World War I itself, and then, as you know from general knowledge, in 1917 there's the October Revolution in Russia. All of those developments in the context of war is going to have an influence on the espionage organizations which establish themselves. Those which are state institutions are what we call statutory forces. And you can see the story starts unfolding in and around 1909. 1909 is when the British Parliament passed the Union of South African Act, which made us become a self-ruled country in 1910. So the story of South Africa as a country and all of these institutions are on the same timeline. Okay? You can see in Britain the story starts with them forming the Secret Service Bureau in 1909. Then by 1911 it splits in terms of who is going to focus on external threats, because Germany is building up in the context of what will become World War I. So who's going to look outside at the interests of Britain? And that is MI6. Who is going to look at the interests of Britain within Britain? That is going to be MI5. So even today, 2023, MI5 and MI6 still exist in Britain. Okay? So that's the British angle. Obviously, this British influence is going to have a direct influence on South Africa, because we were a British colony. If we look at America, it starts off with the Bureau of Investigation in 1908, more or less the same time in America. Then things start changing. 1935, we are building up towards the target being fascism. So the issue of communism is not the priority at the moment. By 1935. And that is when Britain and the CIA are going to drop the ball. And I'm going to show you how. Okay? Eventually, after World War II, in 1947, they established the Central Intelligence Agency. So the CIA operates outside the country. It's not allowed to operate inside the country. MI6 operates outside the country. It's not allowed to operate inside the country. But there again, you know that the 11th commandment in espionage is thou shalt not get caught. And therefore, they do operate inside the country, their own country, but they're allowed to, by law. Okay? It's important to understand this because the American president, particularly that red-headed Donald Trump, thinks that they run the United States of America, but they don't, based on the American Constitution. Congress does. And the only play field which the American president actually has is foreign policy outside the country. So their use of the CIA in particular is paramount. to the power of the American president. Okay? So there you have MI6 and CIA. But what is happening in what was Russia and becomes the Soviet Union? That you know that we have the October Revolution in 1917. I'm talking about the October Revolution. And one of the first institutions to secure the new revolutionary state established is a secret police known as the Cheka. It then became known by 1923, once the Soviet Union has established itself, as the political directorate. Then under Stalin, it becomes known as the NKVD. And then under Khrushchev, it's going to be called the KGB. It changes its name, and then the KGB, okay? What is important to the story is looking in the context of World War II. The Soviet Union, by 1941, is involved in World War II after Operation Barbarossa. And by 1942, they established GRU, G-R-U. That is military intelligence. So in the Soviet Union, you've got GRU and you have got the KGB. Okay? Where it's really important to understand this, here is South Africa and the sort of institutions created in South Africa. I discussed over here briefly. I'm not going to elaborate too much on them. And also we have non-statutory forces, obviously after 1961 with the establishment of Umkhonto-we-Sizwe. It also has an intelligence capability as well. But in Umkhonto-we-Sizwe, etc., up until literally 1994, are called non-statutory forces as opposed to statutory forces. Okay? Now, where does this talk about the FBI, CIA, GRU, and KGB come in? And I want to briefly talk about this book, Dieter Gerhardt. Okay? Dieter Gerhardt was born in 1935, before World War II. He grows up, his father was a firm supporter of what becomes the National Party in 1948. During the context of World War II, he joins the father, the Kosovo Brookbanks, and he, B.J. Forster, Hendrik van der Berg, and so on, are all put into Koffiefontein as a concentration camp in the context of World War II, because they're neo-Nazis. He has a son, which is Dieter, right? When Dieter gets older, more or less 18 years of age and so on, getting out of school, he was as far as his father was concerned, uncontrollable idiot. So he spoke to the head of the Navy in South Africa, Veerman, and said, listen, do me a favor. I want my son to join the Navy and you've got to discipline him, do properly. They said, fine. So he joins the Navy. He has not, at this stage, got any anti-apartheid views whatsoever, despite what he later says. He works his way through the Navy, and he's actually very bright in terms of their courses they offer and so on. And he was eventually, by 1960, understand the time here, by 1960, he is sent by the South African Navy to Britain for further training on British naval ships. This is the time when South Africa becomes a republic. Now Dieter Gerhardt is there, okay? As a SA Navy person. But he decides, the salary is not good enough. And so he decides to walk in to the American offices of their consul in Britain and offer his services to spy for the Americans. Evidently against South Africa, of which he's part of the SA Navy, right? The Americans look at him and say, what are you smoking? And they kick him out. They're going to regret that. And so he decides, let me walk down the road. And he walks in to the Soviet embassy. And he says, I want to offer to spy for you. I'm part of the South African Navy. They didn't say what to swim. But they said, okay, you go out and get us a whole lot of classified secret information and so on, which you maintain you can get, and then come back in a couple of months with it. So he goes out and he manages to get the British Navy to take him and show them all of their new submarines, nuclear submarines and everything, and all their new missiles, all the French missiles. He gets all the plans because he is in the Navy, and he hands that batch over to the embassy official at the Soviet embassy in London. And they think, yo, this is cool. He does have access. Dieter Gerard, as a South African, in the South African Navy, was spying and giving military secrets in the context of the Cold War of Britain and France for money. Okay? Not for ideological reasons. Dieter Gerard then comes back to South Africa. Now he's handled by the group. Okay? Eventually the KGB are going to take over handling him when he's back in South Africa. He then goes up the pecking order of the South African Navy, such that he becomes the South African Navy's liaison officer with NATO. NATO is the military alliance of the Western world against the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. All of the NATO deliberations is handing over. Some of you in grade 11 know, because we've recently looked at it, from 1975, South African National Defence Force is in embroiled hands, including the covert Recce flags were provided by Dieter Gerard to the KGB. All of them. In the 1970s, South Africa developed and tested and produced 6 nuclear warheads with a 7th under construction by the time they dismantled them all. Every bit of planning of the nuclear warheads was made available by Dieter Gerard to the KGB. And you right from the start. A lot of the plans were received from the French and from the Mossad of Israel. All went through to the KGB. Eventually, he had married a woman, an Irish woman, when he was in the UK on his course. He couldn't keep his mouth shut, probably because he got married to her. And when they were back in South Africa, he told her what he was doing. She was ballistically angry, but terrified that she would get locked up as well. And so she divorced him and went back to Ireland with the children. Shortly thereafter, he again married another woman, Ruth Jaw. Ruth Jaw was already working for the GRU, Soviet military intelligence. She was a Swiss citizen, which is meant to be a neutral country. And she served as Dieter Gerard's courier, getting all of the information and that out of the country. Eventually, in 1983, the FBI in America eventually worked out where some of these NATO documents were coming from. And when they liaised with the South African Defence Force, organized that Dieter Gerard had to fly to America for a naval course. And when the plane landed at LaGuardia Airport, the FBI went on board and arrested him. The FBI and CIA interrogated him for a couple of days, and then he was flown back to South Africa, where he was charged for treason. Now remember, 1983 is the peaking period of what we refer to as the New Cold War. and this case is unfolding. At that stage, Dieter Gerhardt was the head of the South African Navy here at Simonstown, down the road from us. But the amount of damage which he did for NATO, Britain, and their security in the context of Cold War, France, and America through NATO, is quite extraordinary. Let alone leaking all the things about our atomic nuclear warhead development here, battle plans in Angola, and so on. Okay? So we've got a close association if we talk in terms of what is happening with these organizations and individuals directly involved. Okay? And here I'm just expanding on the part of that other slide which focuses on Dieter Gerhardt himself. He was charged for treason, and the judge in 1983, the judge in the case was Judge Munich. And he actually made the statement in court, Judge Munich, that if one South African soldier had of died as a consequence of his leaking of documents, and it would be proved, he would get the death sentence. At that time, South Africa had capital punishment, the death sentence. But they gave him life imprisonment. Now, life imprisonment in the days of apartheid meant life imprisonment. Until you died in prison, in other words. Okay? But in 1983, he got life imprisonment. His wife, Ruth Jaw, got 10 years. She, in 1990, was released on parole and sent out of the country, expelled, to Switzerland with her children. In 1992, what had happened in South Africa? From 1989, P.W. Botha had a stroke, no longer president of South Africa, and F.W. de Klerk became the president. In 1990, he unbans the ANC, PAC, and SACP, and we start release political prisoners. Exiles can return, and we start a transition towards a democracy. Meanwhile, the poor boy is hitting the fan in the Soviet Union. 1989, same time, the Soviet satellite states all have revolutions and overthrow their communist rule in 5 months. By the end of 1990, the 3 Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania declared themselves independent from the Soviet Union. And by the end of 1991, the whole of the Soviet Union fragments into its independent republics, rejecting communism. Okay? So the world had changed dramatically. And who emerges in Russia and becomes the president of the Russian Federation by 1992? Boris Yeltsin. And so South Africa never had a relationship with the Soviet Union at all because of communism. Boris Yeltsin's now in charge. And so F.W. de Klerk decides, 1992, I'm going to the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union, to the Russian Federation, and establish diplomatic ties with the Russian Federation. That's his intention. So he arrives in Moscow, and he ends up having conversations with Boris Yeltsin. Boris Yeltsin says, "It's no problem. We will create diplomatic relations with you, even though you're still their party in South Africa. You are going through democratic change. Conditional to you've got to release Dieter Gerhardt from prison." So F.W. Klerk said, fine. So in 1992, he returns to South Africa, signs a presidential order, Dieter Gerhardt released from prison. He was put on a flight, boom, straight through to meet his wife in Switzerland. The two of them then went back to Moscow, and he only died in 2020. Okay? Now, with all of understanding how close we as South Africa are to some of these role players and organizations, what I've emphasized here is that if you look purely at MI6, that's Britain. It increased its focus from 1917 in the context of World War I. It increased its focus on communism after the October Revolution. But its meddling, MI6's meddling, started with the time of the February Revolution in the Soviet Union. And MI6, from its slush fund, provided funding to the provisional government after the February Revolution. And many people ask the question, why did the provisional government, after their revolution, not withdraw from the very unpopular involvement in World War I? The reason they didn't is because of payment from MI6 to keep them involved in the war. When we get to the October Revolution, and now Lenin is in charge, Lenin withdraws Russia from World War I. Lenin then negotiates with Imperial Germany, the enemy of Britain, and they sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was very punishing for Russia, which handed over a lot of land, people, and so on to Imperial Germany, so that Russia could get out of the war. And so MI6, after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, then did an attempt to assassinate V.I. Lenin. But as you know, they were not successful. Okay? Because he carried on living. This background is important because suddenly, in the 1930s, the nature of the threat to these colonial powers changes. It is not prioritizing communism, but the rise of fascism, both in Italy and in Nazi Germany. And it's at this time that a number of people working for MI6 become double agents working for the KGB at the same time as being in the MI6. And two examples which I want to give you is the one is in terms of well-known and so on, and I think there's something at the moment on Netflix about them or whatever, is Kim Philby. He was recruited by Soviet intelligence as a group of 4 people who all studied at Cambridge University. And that's why they became known as the Cambridge Four. The main honcho was Kim Philby of the 4. By 1944, this is nearing the end of World War II, he becomes the MI6's head of Soviet Affairs section. Meanwhile, he's working for the KGB. So he knows every agent, source, whatever, of MI6 against the KGB, and gives it all to the KGB. By 1945, there was a guy called Volkov, Konstantin Volkov. He was part of the KGB, what becomes the KGB, the NKVD, and he was attached to the Soviet embassy in Istanbul, in Turkey. This Volkov phoned he was deputy consul in the Soviet embassy in Istanbul. He phoned his equal deputy consul of the British embassy and said, listen, I want to have a meeting, see if we can do a bit of cooperation. And they ignored him. They thought it was a prank call. Because when does the KGB pick up the phone and actually say, I want to have a bit of a conversation to another spy from another agency? So they ignored it. They thought it was a prank. In the end, a couple of days later, he, with his wife, deputy consul, I want to speak to him. And he said, listen, I can give you, as long as you provide me with a certain amount of money, I can give you 350 agents of the KGB in Turkey. I can give you 240 agents of the KGB in Britain. But most particularly, I can give you 4 MI6 spies as well. I said, okay, now we can talk business. So he said, okay, I'll come back in a couple of days' time, because they said we will have to contact somebody from MI6 to come and speak to you. So he left. The message, by secure means, was couriered from MI6's office in Istanbul to MI6's headquarters in London. This is a great scoop we've got. The head of MI6 says, great, let's provide it to our head of counterintelligence to investigate it further and to meet this guy. And they provided it to the head of counterintelligence of MI6, who was Kim Philby. Kim Philby looks at it and says, oh, it's a problem. You're talking about me, exposing me. So he contacts this KGB person back in Moscow and says, hey, sort this out. And he manages to delay going through to Istanbul to see poor Volkov by 21 days. 3 weeks. By which time the NKVD had both entered, they threw a team from Moscow to Istanbul, walked into the own Soviet embassy, said, hey, comrade, welcome, come. Took him, he was brutally tortured, flew straight back to Moscow, and he has disappeared. Like last month's salary. As a result of being exposed by Kim Philby. Okay? And eventually, Kim Philby himself was going to get exposed, and he fled to the Soviet Union in 1963. And he wrote a book about what he had done from his perspective in 1968. Okay? He's in Moscow, right? When pressure was on that he might be exposed in Britain, he had recruited for the KGB 2 MI6 people, Guy Burgess and Donald McLean. But when the heat was coming on him, then he fed into the MI6. No, these guys also get spies. His own people he recruited for the KGB. And then he gave them a warning. Hey, MI6 is about to get you, go. And they managed to skip the country and went to Moscow. Escape. So when eventually in 1963, Kim Philby is in Moscow, he's got to look face to face with these guys he actually exposed himself. But they actually ended up getting on quite well. Okay. Another individual who worked for MI6 as well is George Black. He was sent to Korea in the context of the Korean War, which was from 1950 to 1953. But he was caught by the North Koreans and jailed. But he was interrogated by KGB in the North Korea. And he himself started thinking, hey, these communists have actually got something. I quite like the way of understanding life in general. And then he decided that he would work for the KGB while he's in prison. Okay? He was then released in a spy swap in 1952 and sent back to Britain. So he's received in Britain as a hero coming home from the Korean War. Meanwhile, he's now working for the KGB. Okay? He gets involved with work with MI6 and so on, and he eventually was sent via Vienna in Austria to Berlin. And Berlin at that stage was walled in West Berlin as a Western enclave of capitalism in a sea of communism. And he managed to get access as MI6 to plans to build, and they built, a 1,600 meter tunnel, Western intelligence, under the wall under the Stasi's headquarters in Berlin. And electronically, they intercepted all of the communication of the Soviets and the GDR. But as they were doing it, Blake was feeding that information to the KGB. So the KGB permitted the building of the wall, of the tunnel, to continue. And to this day, we have no understanding of how much information that picked up by MI6 and the CIA and so on. And in fact, it was a lot of twaddle because it was being disseminated by the KGB and so on. That's George Blake. Okay? He himself was arrested in 1961, convicted and imprisoned in Britain for being a spy. And in 1966, some people, Irish people, actually assisted him of breaking out of prison, and then he managed to skedaddle to Moscow. And he died also 2020, just recently. Okay? After World War II, what we start talking about, statutory forces, non-statutory, and so on and so forth, understand you've got the primary groups, KGB, CIA, MI6, etc., but they work with what I'm referring to here as surrogates. Who is the biggest party in the relationship? And for instance, in Soviet satellite states, you always have the Soviet Union, i.e. the KGB, and in the Soviet satellite state, you have their own police and espionage structure. That was called the Stasi. So an example is the GDR, German Democratic Republic. And this is the emblem of the KGB. That is the emblem of the Stasi, right? In African states, those which became aligned to the Soviet Union, etc., you have, for instance, in Angola, you had the KGB involved, and they were working with the MPLA in Angola. When you talk about South Africa and America, you're talking about the CIA and Department of Military Intelligence, and they were working with UNITA as a surrogate. When you're talking about the ANC being based in Angola with its camps, etc., they are working with the KGB and the Stasi. And what is the ANC's equivalent grouping in Courtoisier and the Department of Intelligence and Security? So understanding the primary group and the surrogate becomes really important, I would suggest, in terms of understanding the relationship. It influences, it underpins the philosophy or approach to intelligence and security. So therefore, the DISs influence understanding by the Stasi and the KGB, right? It influences their methodology and their training in this business of intelligence. And to a lesser extent, it also influences their organizational structure, how they operated. Just to show you the amorphous size of the KGB in terms of the USSR, based on recently declassified records, at its peak in the 1980s, the KGB was comprised of 480,000 personnel. 480,000 personnel. But they also had 80,000 border guards around the Soviet Union. An amorphous infrastructure and personnel. Wherever they were in the world, in terms of their spheres of influence, they had a footprint as well. I put up here intentionally a breakdown of their different type of structures, directorates, which goes to show how complex it is as to who works for what directorate with what sort of authority. The problem with such an amorphous infrastructure is there's very little effective communication. And they become like mini espionage agencies on their own. Okay? When it comes to what I've explained to you in terms of the various individuals I've quoted so far, what you've got to understand is if a person worked as a KGB operative from the Soviet Union and they are working in Britain, they can have two different kinds of status. If they are attached to the embassy, then they are what we refer to as a legal resident. Okay? If they are not attached to an embassy, they are working with a false identity, with what in espionage talk is called a ledger, which they built up over a long period of time. Then they are referred to as an illegal resident. It has consequences for the person, whether they're a legal resident or illegal resident. Because if you are a legal resident, it means that you are declared to the host country, MI6 in this case, Britain, to the MI6. And they agree that you can be at the embassy under a false function, like you are a press attaché or something like that, as long as you don't get caught with your hand in the cookie jar. Don't spy on us. Okay? Again, remember that 11th commandment. But if they do get caught out, then they are held by the host espionage agency, and then they are sent out of the country, back to the Soviet Union. Of British CIA, MI6 have been caught in the Soviet Union, then they are swapped for this person. Okay? Because as soon as you are kicked out of the country, you are called persona non grata. You no longer have diplomatic immunity, boom, out, get out, and never come back again. But if you are an illegal resident, you don't have that protection at all. If you are caught, you are charged for treason and you will be in prison or get executed depending on what the host country's stance is. And the agency for which you work has what was called plausible deniability. So for instance, the KGB, when Dieter Gerard was caught, said, "Oh guys, I don't know what you guys are talking about. We don't know who this dude is at all." And it's called plausible deniability. Okay? So there's a consequence being a legal resident, illegal resident, and it impacts on how the story of the individual case studies I mentioned unfold. What do intelligence agencies actually do? They identify and evaluate risks, threats, and opportunities. They assess its capacity to react to such risks, threats, and opportunities within the very fluid dynamic of international relations. Underpinning its function is the protection of the state. And therefore, we talk about national security and national interest. What are they meant to do? They are meant to forewarn the state about what is happening. They're not talking about history. That's my job as a history teacher. They're talking about what's going to happen in the future. They forewarn. They deliver related insights and intelligence to the decision makers. The recipient of state intelligence in South Africa today is the state president. And they anticipate the future, they anticipate what's going to happen in the future far better and faster than their adversaries, i.e. other intelligence agencies around the world. They use open sources. That is from newspapers, academic institutes, NGOs, think tanks, blah, 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 all those open sources. They get access to that information. They also, when necessary, use covert intelligence, which is the very secret part of intelligence. And remember, that's some covert. intelligence. There is what is referred to as human, that is human intelligence, or there is tech-int, which is technical intelligence. And technical intelligence is the biggest covert capacity. For instance, what was made public only in 2010 is what is referred to as Five Eyes. That is the cooperation between electronic surveillance and interception of the USA, they call it the NSA, of the UK, based at GCHQ, of Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. Now they've expanded the Five Eyes to what they call the 14 Eyes, including these countries as well. They are able to, for instance, cover every single cell phone communication. Every time you are sending a social media tweet, these guys are intercepting it. They are able to integrate from satellites photographs which they can take of you sitting on Founders Field reading a newspaper. They can look and see precisely what page of what newspaper it is. That's what they assimilate electronically. It's amorphous. South Africa has an interception electronic capability which, when it was installed in the new South Africa, its computer system was bigger than the computer system which runs the entire AXA Bank group. It is ginormous what it can do. And every social media, Facebook issue is monitored. I'm not threatening you. Carry on doing whatever you want with your social media. Understand, it's all intercepted. Okay? In conclusion, this is what South African intelligence looks like after the transition to democracy by 1994. And it's now called the State Security Agency. It has a foreign department, and it has a domestic branch. Okay, that is what we have today. What it used to be is called the NIA, and South African Secret Service, domestic and foreign. It had military intelligence and crime intelligence. After 1994, with integrated legislation and so on controlling its activities. But now, with the impact of state capture, it is now one thing called the State Security Agency. Have a